The Football World Cup in Brazil has been widely viewed as a success. The mass protests against the vast spending on the tournament failed to materialise, and Brazil reached the semi-finals of the competition. But what about Brazil itself? Well, joining me now to talk about it is our chief foreign affairs commentator, Gideon Rachman. Gideon, you just returned from a trip to Brazil where you even managed to watch some football. Predictions of protests against the tournament, like I said, failed to materialise. Do you think that the country has instead been caught up in the melodrama of the competition?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. I mean, Brazil is absolutely transfixed by the tournament, and you get a sense of how it's eclipsed other worries by what happened last weekend, where there was a tragic accident in Belo Horizonte on Thursday. A couple of people were killed as an overpass collapsed, and that was exactly the kind of thing that people feared would happen ahead of the tournament. But in the event, all the anxiety about that and the upset was eclipsed by the fact that the game was played next day between Brazil and Colombia, and Brazilians in fact seemed much more upset by the fact that Neymar, their star player, had fractured a vertebra in his back in a winning performance against Colombia than by the accident in Belo Horizonte, which showed the way that the football is just kind of overwhelming those social concerns.
Yes, you mentioned the tragic accident there. There were a lot of fears before the tournament about Brazil's creaking infrastructure and whether it could actually cope in hosting such a tournament. Was that your experience of things?
Well, obviously the accident in Belo Horizonte was an awful occurrence and exactly the kind of thing people were fearing ahead of the tournament. But it has to be said, so far it does seem to be an isolated, albeit awful, incident. And talking to fans, and in fact myself travelling a bit around the country between a few cities, things have been going very smoothly. The stadiums, which people said wouldn't be ready, have worked very well. Flights have appeared on time, and generally I think people have had a very positive experience of the Brazilian World Cup, the kind of visitors who've come, and that obviously is exactly what Brazil wanted. It was the positive image they're trying to project and why they bid so much money for the tournament in the first place.
And yet, despite all of this perceived success, problems clearly remain under the surface. Do you think there's a danger that the discontents that we saw before the tournament will resurface once the World Cup circus leaves town?
Well, that's the big question. One might almost call it the $11 billion question, because that's how much money Brazil will have splashed out on getting the tournament ready. It's not at all clear whether Brazilians' positive feelings about the football and excitement will mean that they then just say, oh, well, all the concerns that we were expressing in the year ahead of the tournament about decaying infrastructure, about the lack of transport and sanitation and all the obvious needs that Brazilian society still has, whether that will be glossed over by the football. And it matters politically hugely because President Dilma Rousseff is up for re-election in October, and her reception at the first game was not a positive one. She got booed when she appeared. She'll be hoping that when she reappears at the final game, and she'll be flanked by the presidents of China and other leaders of the BRIC nations who are in town for a summit, she'll be hoping that she gets a much more positive reception, and that perhaps might be an indication that the World Cup has indeed created the kind of feel-good effect that Dilma wants ahead of her re-election campaign.
And just the final question on the Brazilian economy itself. I mean, what's your take on the outlook for Brazil? Is there a sense that it hasn't progressed in the way that it perhaps should have, and that the glitz and glamour involved in a World Cup actually has masked some of that?
Well, that is the big question, and the big question mark over Brazil's future is that if you remember when they were awarded the World Cup, and then shortly afterwards when they were awarded the Olympics, that reflected the sense of excitement about Brazil, not just in the country itself, but in the world at large. People felt that Brazil was the kind of exciting frontier emerging market, and at the time under President Luiz Inácio da Silva, who was Dilma's predecessor, the economy was growing at an average of 4%, even touched 7% in 2010. Now things have slowed down. That's not entirely Dilma's fault, but the economy is growing at about 2%, and that doesn't generate the same kind of excitement and the same revenues that the Brazilian government needs to pour into social programs. And it's not clear that Dilma has a very convincing program for reigniting growth in Brazil. And that really is, I think, the big question mark over her political future. I think the odds are that she'll still be re-elected because people hope that growth will come back, and also, frankly, the rivals to her aren't that inspiring yet. But yes, the question marks over Brazil's economy is the kind of question mark hovering behind the World Cup and about the president of Brazil's future.
Okay, well, Gideon, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.